Our overland builds aren't just vehicles. They're the culmination of years of experience, adventure, and hard-earned lessons. We've been tested, pushed, and inspired, and it's shaped not only how we build, but how we live and pursue adventure. In this episode, we share the stories and philosophies that guide every choice behind our rigs. So stick around until the end to find out what 3 questions you should be asking yourself and find out what it means to be an overlander, tourer, or safari bush camper. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and to episode 3 of Where the Pavement Ends. Today we're diving into a topic that often gets overlooked at the start, and understandably so. The excitement of jumping right in can be overwhelming as we're eager to get moving, but when it comes to a major investment like an overland build, it can pay to slow down, think strategically, and define your build philosophy before you begin. So for us, an overland build philosophy is the mindset that guides your design build, suited to meet your budget, priorities, and goals. It's about aligning your vehicle with your values and style of travel, keeping the focus on experiences and not just the gear. So we think having clarity on what's shaped you, what's motivating you to step into or grow within the overland space can make all the difference in your overland philosophy. Because let's face it, once you start, an overland build never truly ends. There's always something to tweak, add, or replace. So a clear philosophy keeps you grounded as the process evolves and can help you prioritize and better understand what matters most along the way. So I'm your host, Vince Brody, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Terrell Graham. Terrell, welcome back to the channel. Episode 3, how does it feel to get this far?
I'm doing great, and I hope all of our viewers are too. I have to say, I'm genuinely surprised by how much we've learned in just these 2 episodes, honestly. This process has already given us valuable lessons and continues to push us to grow, reflect, and even sharpen how we approach the podcast. I'm glad we've made the decision to keep going. We're still small, and there's a lot of hard work ahead, but with feedback from our viewers and intentional focus, I know we'll get there. What excites me most is that our earlier listeners will truly see that progress firsthand, and that's motivating me to do even better with each episode.
Yeah, you're right, Terrell. There's a lot of work that goes into this. I know I've gained a whole new appreciation for every podcaster out there. I think if you saw episode 1 to now, you would see there's a huge difference just in our setup, our sound quality, our lighting, our background. Everything is just starting to take on new shape and form, and that's exciting. And so, as you mentioned, the process continues to be a learning experience for us, and that's been the most rewarding part of all this. We've stepped into something totally new and unfamiliar. And that's exactly what overland travel is all about, embracing the unknown and growing through the experience. And so speaking of journeys, in the last episode, we talked about, a new Tundra purchase for you. You got any updates on that one?
Yeah, so after we recorded episode 2, I got to working on the Tundra. I've put new tires on it, and I've started prepping it for the camper to get installed. I still need to add airbags to the rear, but it's coming along. Slowly I'll get there. Over the weekend, I did switch gears a little bit, and I traveled up to Wisconsin for a different type of adventure. I went to Road America, which is a legendary 4-mile road course that's been around since the 1950s, one of the premier racing tracks in the U.S., actually. I spent some time there with my wife watching the GT World America race and taking in that whole experience. It's a different side of the automotive world, but it definitely ties back to that same passion for vehicles that we talk about here on this podcast. But what about you? What have you been working on lately?
Yeah, it's cool to see your progress with the Tundra build. We'll throw some photos up of, your experience with the racing over the weekend. Some of the photos you shared with me were pretty cool. On my end, I'm still in the daily grind, balancing podcast prep, video editing. I'm still doing a lot of my online courses and, just sending out job applications. I've got an interview coming up next week. And I've just been trying to keep up with my running every morning to stay healthy and focused, But honestly, Terrell, this podcast has given me new energy. I haven't felt this excited about something in a long time, and it feels great to be here recording our 3rd episode. I'm really enjoying the creative process, learning the ins and outs of YouTube and exploring how new tools like AI make it all easier and a lot more fun. So yeah, that growing and learning piece of it all is just super exciting. So with that in mind, what do you say we dive in? How do you want to kick things off today?
Well, before we dive in, it's important to say that this episode isn't a a walk around video of our rigs. It's you know, we're not here to list every piece of gear. Instead, we're going back to the beginning, really how each of us first got into overlanding and how those early experiences shaped the philosophies and adventure spirit that we still carry today. The overland builds aren't just about vehicles or gear. They're reflections of lived experiences, lessons learned, and also the way we approach travel and adventure. From there, we'll explore what overlanding means to us, why having a build philosophy really matters, and the core principles behind our own. And just to be clear, we're not full time overlanders. The stories and perspectives we share are rooted in trips lasting anywhere from 1 to 8 weeks, including Vince's international experiences. And along the way, we'll share some lessons learned and hopefully offer some tips to help others shape their own approach. So what do you think? Does that sound like a good way to frame today's conversation?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right approach because, like you said, our rigs aren't just one, they're just one piece of the bigger story. What really matters are the experiences and philosophies that shape how we build, travel, and ultimately how we live. For me, overlanding didn't just start with a vehicle. It started long before with my background, my upbringing, and the kind of adventures I sought in different parts of the world. It's amazing how those early experiences really influence how I think about adventure travel today. And they've guided every decision I've made when it comes to building a vehicle. So maybe that's where we start by going back to those chapters in our lives that led us here. Because once you understand the why, the what of the build starts to make a lot more sense. So how about you kick us off?
Okay, yeah, great, yeah. So for me, I grew up in North Carolina, and honestly, off roading wasn't really something I was exposed to. Sure, some people went mudding here and there, but that never really quite caught my interest. It wasn't until when I was stationed in Hawaii that I first kind of started noticing people with 4x4 trucks, and of course, out there they roll around in these really old school Toyotas on 35-inch tires, which are awesome. And there aren't many places to do serious off-roading in Hawaii. What people really did was drive on the beach, right? That's where they spent most of their time.
Yeah, I can picture that. Hawaii, the ocean right there, trucks cruising on the sand, surfboards laying in the bed. Man, it sounds like the perfect place to catch the bug.
Yeah. Yeah, though I'll admit my first rig, man, wasn't much of an overlander. It was a two-wheel drive 4Runner. Definitely not an overland vehicle by any stretch. I take it out on the beach, right? And thinking I was cool and all. And of course, every time I would get stuck, all the time I was getting stuck.
So let me guess, there was always a line of people ready to help push you out when you got stuck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thankfully those folks were always willing to really give me a hand, and eventually I upgraded to a Jeep, which made a lot more sense for that type of environment, rolling around with the doors off, top off, and just enjoying that island lifestyle.
Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, man, I don't see you as a Jeep guy, but that's a big jump from a two-wheel drive 4Runner to a Jeep. But I imagine being in Hawaii, that must have been the definition of freedom out there, right?
Yeah, it truly was. Yeah. So later though, I got reassigned to the DC area, and things really started to shift there. I joined my first off-road club, and while a lot of the Jeep guys were into hardcore trails and would either basically they would just head home or grab a hotel room after we would hit the trails, I found myself really wanting something different.
How so?
Yeah, I wanted to just stay out there longer. I wanted to immerse myself in nature instead of just driving through it. And that's when I started bringing backpacking gear along, and I would just camp after the trail rides. I'd do some hiking. I spent a lot of time taking photos, just extending the experience of being outside. And at that time, I didn't even realize, well, that was overland. I just thought it was my way of enjoying the great outdoors. But looking back, that was really the beginning of my philosophy, using the vehicle not just as a tool for off-roading, but really as a base for deeper exploration.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's like you weren't just chasing the trail, you were chasing the whole experience of being out there.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And eventually I did transition into a Toyota FJ Cruiser, and that's where things really took off. I added a rooftop tent to that vehicle. I focused on being more self-reliant, and slowly I built out that rig. And I'll admit I probably went a little too far at times, but those lessons are really part of the journey.
Yeah, we've all been there, going overboard on the build until you realize sometimes less is more.
Right, yeah. But the The big light bulb moment for me was really this wasn't just about driving or camping. It was about community, connection, creating experiences that really lasted. And the Toyota FJ Club, the FJ Bruisers, really connected the dots for me. They were not just about off-roading, they were about cooking together at camp, helping each other out, and sharing that sense of adventure. And that's where my overland philosophy really started to form.
Yeah, I love that. It's the people and the stories that stick with you long after the trail. I mean, look at us, right? Our friendship.
Yeah,
So, for me, it really goes back to childhood. If I'm jumping into my own definition of overlanding and, so what kind of influenced me, I was lucky. I only have good memories of those years. My parents met in the Philippines where I was born, and I spent the first 15 years of my life bouncing between the Philippines and Peru. And my dad was always taking me on adventures, and even when I wasn't on one, I'd make my own. I remember building little shelf roads out of dirt, driving matchbox cars around roots, pretending I was in some far off expedition.
yeah, I can just see a picture, of you out there in the dirt, with those cars, and then, so even back then, you were kinda staging your own little overland trips, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in the Philippines, we travel around in either a jeepney or a Plymouth caravan, heading up into places like Baguio City. My brothers and I would go cardboarding, not snowboarding, but literally sliding down slopes on flattened boxes.
That's
And if
crazy.
you've and if you've never seen a jeepney, it's basically the king of public transportation in the Philippines. They're these bright color vehicles, there's chrome everywhere, stretched out jeeps left behind after World War II and converted into these, huge people movers. Yeah, they're kind of like the chicken buses in Guatemala, loud, crowded, absolutely iconic. We actually had one of our own, except ours was plain white, but I thought it was the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, that's really wild, man. I love to see a photo, of younger Vince back in the day in a Jimny. If you can find that, please share it with us.
Oh man, I'll have to see if I can dig one up and share it in a later episode. But our Jim Lee was totally plain compared to the wild ones on the street, but it was still awesome. And then when we were in Peru, my dad bought and restored this old Dodge Dart. The wipers didn't work, so literally he'd lean out with a squeegee while driving, sometimes on these narrow shelf roads in the Andes. Probably not the safest method, but it made for good stories. And honestly, I used to poke fun at him when the same thing happened to me years later in Guatemala.
Yeah, that's a classic dad move right there.
It definitely was. But that's just who my dad was. In Peru, we do a lot of beach camping or head out toward the edge of the Amazon, probably into places we weren't even supposed to be in. I just remember riding in the back of a pickup bed with my brothers, staring up in awe at the Andes towering over us. And on this one particular trip to Pazuzu, which is this remote German-influenced village and a 12-hour drive from Lima, we had to cross active landslides. So I remember sprinting across one as rocks came tumbling down around me. And those were the kinds of moments that where I really learned about adventure and how to push past my own limits, really defined my tolerance for remote travel and kept me wanting more. Another thing I remember is that I used to see my dad leaving the house in these safari colored vests with his aviator glasses on and with an Atlanta Braves cap. And then at dinner, he'd tell us stories about flying helicopters into the Huallaga Valley or up to Tarapoto and Iquitos in Peru. And to me, he just looked like the ultimate real life G.I. Joe. And through it all, my mom was always right there by our side. I mean, because my dad was always off in the jungle somewhere. I don't know if you're picking up a pattern there, but she was the one that really, really raised us. And honestly, I'm surprised she let me tag along on some of the trips with my dad because they were just totally wild, especially back then when the Shining Path was active in Peru. And if people remember the Shining Path, they were a Maoist guerrilla group that waged a brutal insurgency from 1980, using terror and violence to try to overthrow the government until its decline after the 1992 capture of its leader, Abimael Guzman. And in fact, man, this is how close it got to our family. One of my neighbors had been kidnapped and held hostage by the Shining Path. And this happened and then on another episode, one afternoon after school, I just remember being thrown off my bed from a huge explosion near my house. So definitely wild times, but that's definitely shaped my experience.
Yeah, that's a crazy story, man. So basically your dad was planting that adventure DNA in you from the start. Your early experiences were teaching you grit.
Yeah, more like shoving it in my throat or down my throat. But yeah, 100%. And when I think about those adventures today, they still feel so fresh in my body. I think it really taught me to lean into challenges and adversity. And while the FJ Cruiser was my first real overland rig, it wasn't until I moved to Zimbabwe in 2012 that I really dipped my toes into the lifestyle. I left the FJ back home and bought this mid 90s Mitsubishi Pajero. Paid about 9 or 10 grand for it. And the only mod I did was slap on some 31-inch tires. Didn't even have working AC, which was a big mistake. My girlfriend at the time hated me for it because, when it's 40, 50 degrees Celsius outside, which is over 100 degrees, the inside of the vehicle turns into a sauna, even when the window's down.
Yeah, I can imagine rolling around in Zim with no AC. That's probably not, you're not definitely winning any points with that one.
No, man, not at all. But that Pajero took us everywhere. We went to places like Monopools, Wangay National Park, Victoria Falls, Lake Kariba, Chimanimani. I even did my first international vehicle boarding crossing in that Pajero, heading all the way north to Nampula, Mozambique, which was about an 18-hour drive from Harare. That trip alone could probably fill an entire episode, especially the crisis management parts of what happened on that trip. But hey, I was out there in the African bush seeing real overlanders and vehicles like Nissan Patrols, Land Rover Defenders and Toyota Land Cruisers. And these things were outfitted with bull bars and snorkels. And that's really where I started to fall in love with the overland lifestyle. But out there, they refer to it as safari or just being out in the bush. Overlanding wasn't even in my vernacular at the time. I just saw it as kind of bush camping.
Yeah, so that's where the bug really bit you then, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And I might be kind of going off a little topic here, but that's also where I fell in love with the Rhodesian Ridgeback, which is another big part of my life. I'd constantly see Ridgebacks at all of the safari lodges that I went to. There are these regal dogs just roaming the grounds, looking like they're living their best life. And they just had such a presence at every one of these safari lodges I was staying at. So I actually ended up getting my first Ridgeback in Zimbabwe from this older gentleman named Steven. And then when I went to his house, his garage was just full of Land Rover Defenders, with these rooftop tents on them. And he'd been bush camping his whole life and grew up with Rhodesian Ridgebacks. And I just remember thinking to myself, man, this is the life I want. So, it's funny. I began to associate Ridgebacks with adventure travel.
Yeah, that's a really good story. It sounds like between your childhood in the Philippines and Peru and then those Zimbabwe trips, the path of overlanding was already kinda laid out for you.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I mean, looking back, I realize, how lucky I've been. Not everyone gets that kind of childhood or even the chance to keep that spirit alive as an adult, which is partly it's a main part of this podcast, the importance of play as adults. And, I've now lived and worked in 10 countries, 12 if you count the Philippines and Peru. I've traveled to more than 80 countries. I've done safaris across multiple countries in Southern and Eastern Africa. You're right in the back of Land Cruisers and Defenders, slowly picking up how these vehicles are built for the bush. And, later when I was in South Sudan as a procurement manager, I had the fun of ordering 12 fully outfitted Land Cruisers from Gibraltar, which is, where Toyota actually fabricates Land Cruisers specifically for Africa and specifically for the UN and NGO world. So for me, that adventurous spirit has always been there, and overlanding just became the natural extension of it.
Yeah, that's great, and it's a really good segue into our next topic, which is, what does overlanding really mean to us? But before we dive or before we define overlanding in our own words, it's really worth introducing someone who's been a major influence for many of us in the United States, and that's Scott Brady. If you're not familiar with him, Scott co-founded Expedition Portal and Overland Journal, and is widely accredited with popularizing overlanding in the North American space through his magazine, The Forums, and his recent book on Overlanding 101.
Yeah, and those platforms have been huge for overlanders like us, offering both inspiration and practical guidance while also connecting all of us to each other, including you and me. It's also been great to see them launch podcasts, where we can learn about, other overlanders and things like how suspension works. So I know you and I have definitely benefited from the articles and insights shared by experienced overlanders on those platforms.
Yeah, exactly. So according to Overland Journal, Overlanding is described as self-reliant adventure travel to remote destinations where the journey is the primary goal. And that idea frames overlanding as more than moving from really, A to B. It's about the exploration with intention, really. Another perspective from Expedition Portal simplifies it even further. It talks about overlanding as a self-reliant vehicle-based adventure travel, and I like that because it really emphasizes the idea of being adventurous and mobile, not necessarily off road or ultra equipped. And we'll add a link to the article to where you can see more of how Expedition Portal defines overland.
So it sounds like mindset, self-reliance, and travel are key elements.
Yeah, exactly. And that really underscores why we meet so many ordinary people doing extraordinary things out on the trail. Not just big YouTubers or ultra rigged influencers, but everyday adventurers in bikes, even sedans, RAV4s, and even motorcycles. And they're just out there exploring the world with self reliance and curiosity. But what's more important to remember, though, is that overlanding doesn't really look the same everywhere, right? So in Africa, for example, you might need a highly capable rig to cross rough terrain for days at a time. In fact, Toyota makes a different version of Land Cruiser, just like you mentioned earlier, Vince. They make a different one specifically for Africa. And earlier you shared statistics that basically in South Sudan, which is similar to the size of the state of Texas, has less than 160 miles of paved road. Now, Texas has over 300,000 miles of paved road. So just that's just insane. So here in the US, we have a more developed road network, even though here in Chicago it might not seem that way where I live. Some of these roads are like Baja tracks. But out west where many of our trips really take us, the challenges are different. We have long distance, remote desert stretches, or even high altitude trails. And that's where the misconception really comes in. A lot of people think that you need that six-figure expedition vehicle to be an overlander. But the reality is it depends on where you're going and what you're trying to do. Someone in a motorcycle or even a modest crossover that might be packed with the right gear and the right mindset, it can be just as much of an overlander as someone in a fully built 4x4. And that's what makes this space so interesting. There's no real single formula, just different approaches to really the same spirit of exploration.
You got it. Yeah, I really like that. A lot to think about. So how would you define overlanding for you, as Terrell Graham?
Yeah, so for me, I've come to see overlanding as being less about the vehicle itself and more about self sufficiency. Earlier on, I thought you had to have some kind of hardcore off road rig, specifically 4-wheel drive, big tires, the whole package, right? But over time, I've realized that it's really about how self reliant you are. It's the mindset of carrying what you need, adapting to the challenges, and really being prepared to sustain yourself wherever the journey takes you.
Yeah, so for me, I've always been inspired by the Aussies and their approach to adventure. I hear them call it touring or tough touring. But guys like Timmy Has Heart, Tyler Thompson, and the 24/7 four-wheel drive crew, those builds and those trips, with their train canopy, swag lifestyle, that really lines up with the kind of adventures that I love to do in the patrol. I like tackling the hard stuff in the GQ. Back in Guatemala, my focus was really on outfitting both the patrol and the FJ specifically for jungle expeditions. But, now that I'm back here in the States and I've got Shorty with me, I've dialed that back quite a bit. My focus now with the patrol is trying to get it a little bit more roadworthy, but still capable as a weekend tough tour. Taking on trails like Potts Creek. And, I know you and I talk a lot, Terrell, about, possibly moving out farther west one day. If we ever do that, I'd love to, run Moab or the Morrison Jeep Trail and Shorty. And then on the flip side, you've got creators like Overland Escape, Grizzly and Bear, and Roam Overlanding. Those guys capture the Africa and global side of overlanding. The heart of world travel, safari, and bush camping. And, honestly, sometimes it's hard for me to watch their channels because I feel a little bit of jealousy on my end, right? Because I want to be out there. I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but it's definitely inspiring. But, every time I watch that stuff, I'm just like, I want to be out there. But, their builds are more focused on safari or bush camping. And Lay, who is from Australia, from Grizzly and Bear, and his partner Steph, who's from France, I think they do a really good job of blending touring, safari, and global philosophies so well. They've got that Land Rover Defender with the four-wheel camper and flatbed. But, all three of those channels are doing extraordinary things, to your point, and I tip my hat to them. Their style of travel is more focused on remote backcountry, immersing in local culture and connecting with nature. And I think that's what I really prioritize with my Ford Ranger build. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, the Patrol for me means touring, tough touring, and the Ranger is really about overlanding. You might be thinking, is there a difference? I would say yes and no. I think here in the US, overlanding tends to mean, more about backcountry adventure travel. I think there's a heavier focus on gear here in the US and on, like, trying to be as comfortable as you can in the outdoors, while you're on remote trails with epic views. And then I think in Australia, touring is more about that outback travel in 4x4 or caravan. And that's why you see companies like ARB just doing such rigorous testing on their gear and equipment. And I think that adventure culture just seems to run in their blood in Australia. And then in Africa, from my own experience, I mean, safari is just really about bush travel. So it's deeply tied to nature, wildlife, and conservation. So I think there's more of an emphasis on safety, conservation, those reciprocal relationships with nature, and you just really cohabiting with wildlife. So there's an entire safari culture built around that, and a way of life, a lifestyle and travel. So for me, I connect with all three of those approaches. And I think together they shape my overland build philosophy. But at this point in my life, I'm all about backcountry travel, using my rig for multi-day or weekend trips where I can mountain bike, snowboard, hike, pack raft, trail run, or just simply be outside. And to your point, Terrell, like my focus is on being self-reliant. I want to have a solid shelter and be able to stay off grid in beautiful spots for days without needing to roll into town. I want to be in places where I can push my body and enjoy my athleticism before old age catches up to me. I want to wake up at sunrise. I know you and I do that quite a bit, to hear the birds and take photos. So that's what I love, and that's what keeps me going in normal life. So, I use overland travel as inspiration for all other aspects in my life. And at this point, it's not, I'm not trying to build a rig I can park outside of a 5-star hotel. I'm also not trying to build the coolest, highest rig with the biggest tires. It's more of just building a tool that gets me as far as possible from concrete and crowds, somewhere where I can reconnect with adventure, immerse in nature, and share that experience with the people I love. And that's really at the heart of what, we're trying to get to here, right? Is designing something that lets you explore the outdoors in your way for as long as you can and you're comfortable with, and that's safe and sustainable.
Yeah, that's the thing I love, right? Seeing how different regions shape the way people approach this lifestyle. Whether it's, out in the Aussies with their touring rigs, in Africa with their safari builds, or guys here in the States building everything from Tacomas to Subarus. The styles are really different. But at the heart of it, it's really the same. And I think that's a good place for us to shift gears a little bit beyond the vehicles, right? And the gear. What really defines this whole experience are the philosophies, the values, and the driving motivations we bring to it. And at the end of the day, overlanding isn't about where you go or what you drive. It's about how you approach the journey and how you connect with the environment and the principles that really guide you along the way. And as well as follows some universal key rules here. So maybe this is a good time for us to dive over into the to our Overland philosophy, the core principles, the values that keep us grounded, shape how we build, and really influence the way we travel.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So what do you got for us in terms of your overland build philosophy? I'm curious to learn more about it.
Yeah, so for me, the first one is simplicity, right? I live by the so-called KISS approach. Keep it simple, stupid. I try not to overbuild because I know I'm probably going to, me end up moving to another truck in a few years, and you rarely get that money back on all the extra gear that goes along with it that you spend money on. Plus, simpler setups are easier to troubleshoot, maintain, and when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's important. The second one is self-sufficiency, and that goes way beyond the vehicle. It's about me as well. So it's having the recovery gear and knowing how to use it, but it also is about having medical training and the supplies to take care of yourself, or if someone else, if things go sideways, you need to be able to help people out. And being truly self-reliant means you're ready for whatever the backcountry throws at you. And then also another one is simply respect for nature. That's another big one. Most of the time we're out in state or national forest and we don't take care of those places. If we leave it trash, we tear up the trails, or we really ignore that leave no trace principle, it kind of ruins it for everyone. The way that I see it is part of this lifestyle is being a good steward to the land. And the last one for me is remembering that the journey is truly the reward. I'll admit I sometimes get that tunnel vision. I'm focused on the destination, right? But some of the best parts of any trip are the little stops along the way, that diner or that coffee shop, that little quirky roadside attraction. Overlanding is about slowing down, paying attention, and really enjoying the ride, not just racing to the end. And those are the core values that I keep coming back to no matter what I'm driving or where I'm going.
Yeah, I like all of those core values. They resonate very deeply with me, and I'll just add to some of them. Mine are pretty similar to yours. There's some overlap, and they really center around three big questions, sort of like where I start with my overland build philosophy. And I think these can be applicable to everyone just getting started. So the three kind of big questions are, where do I plan to take my vehicle? Who's coming with me? And how do I plan to sleep? So the first question determines sort of that vehicle selection and your design build around its capability. The second question determines the floor plan of the build. And then the third question really determines everything else, in my opinion. So I think once you have the answers to these three questions up front, it really keeps you focused on strategy and philosophy. And it gives you that disciplined framework for how to approach your build. So my pillars really come down to a few other things. First, knowing yourself. What are your priorities, your habits, your comfort zones? In my case, I travel solo about 99% of the time. Sometimes, with my dog, actually most of the time with my dog. So my rigs and gear reflect that. At one point I was traveling with 3 large dogs in the back of the truck, which was chaos, to be honest. But, I want something capable, nimble, and versatile that can handle the kind of terrain that can get me 6 hours away from the pavement. I have a really high tolerance for remoteness, and I'm not afraid of discomfort or, just being away from things that, can be distractions at home. My ideal camp is you throwing it in 4x4 low, but sometimes I also want to camp near a trailhead so I can finish a trail run or mountain bike ride at the same spot I started from. I also want dark skies, no internet, a good book, and to enjoy the company I bring. Or sometimes just having, some of that solitude, that's really the reward for me. And then a second piece of this is about protection and preparedness. I mean, it goes to your point, Tara, about, recovery and first aid. But it's also on our truck. So I look at bumpers, sliders, and recovery gear, almost like insurance, to borrow from the 24/7 four-wheel drive guys. They talk about that a lot. Yeah, I want my vehicle to handle animal strikes, bad drivers, or tough tracks with confidence. I keep my builds clean on the outside, no clutter, no bolt-ons hanging off, low center of gravity. I like everything tucked inside. Even recently, I pulled off the awning of my rig and I put it away because, I'd rather stay streamlined. Just found like I wasn't using it that much. I mean, it's nice to have, and I'm sure one day I'll kind of put it back on there, but for now, I just like to have it off. And in a way, too, I wish four-wheel camper just would come out with a model that has an awning already integrated into their design. More on the four-wheel camper stuff later. And then the third is adaptability. Nothing in my rig is permanent. I've been running a simple 20-quart cooler for about 10 years, and it's worked just fine. I might be the only one that's in a cooler amongst, the overland groups we go out with, but I also use Wolfpack boxes or rigid tool drawers instead of complex drawer systems or electrical fridge systems. For me, less weight means less to fix and more freedom. So I try to have that backpacker mindset, a pack light, a pack smart, really defines how I set up my trucks on the inside. And, like I said, I also need room for my dogs, my mountain bike, my snowboard gear, that pack raft. And so I want to use my gear interchangeably with different adventures. So I like to just keep everything flexible and agile. And then the fourth and last piece is that freedom, right? Like I don't want to be tied down to any gadgets. That means no Starlink, no movie nights. And I really try not to work when I'm on the road. Think about work while I'm overlanding. I just want to be like totally immersed in the moment. And I just want that complete disconnection. But like you, man, I think the sleeping pad setup is the foundation. I've gone through rooftop tents, hammocks, swags. But, once you experience that four-wheel camper, it's really hard to go back. Like that just changes everything. And as I mentioned, how you sleep and where you want to go really shape your entire build. And now that I've experienced four-wheel camper life, there is absolutely no going back for me. So the patrol is in a different category, of course. I mean, that's swag life. But at the end of the day, my rigs are built to take me deep into the backcountry, adapt to whatever adventure I'm chasing. And, I want to be safe, simple, and free while I'm out there. And then I'll just add this one other last point, Terrell. I've also seen that, traveling through places like Zimbabwe, Guatemala, and Honduras, those remote backcountry trips weren't just about the roads or rigs. They were really about the culture and people, figuring out where to get provisions in some of these remote areas. I mean, you experienced that too when we were in Washington, learning the local norms and sharing in the daily rhythms of a community gave me an immersion you can't get any other way. And I think overlanding is one of the best ways to really experience that. And I just found through those trips, it made me better at work because I could immerse myself into what people were actually experiencing in real life out in those communities. I also just felt that a lot of those trips, when you're having to figure things out on your own, you find that it just makes you a more creative problem solver, and you can, really connect to people easier because you're taking yourself out of your comfort zone and you're learning more about yourself and how you deal with adversity, and you're bringing back those skills into the office. And I just think it just made me a better person. And so I wouldn't trade it for the world. And yeah, that's something Overland taught me in a really unique way.
Yeah, that's powerful, man. I really like how you tied it back to the people because at the end of the day, that's, the rigs, the gear, even the landscapes. Those are just the backdrop, right? It's
Mhm.
the human connection and what you carry forward into your life that really sticks. And I think you're on the right, I think you're right. That kind of perspective really makes you sharper, more grounded, and even more aware of what really matters. It's also amazing that no matter how far you travel, someone or somehow, once you really get to that spot, it's like being back in home, right? It just feels so natural. It's like the land already knows you, and it's that deep connection to nature we've been consistently, talking about. And that actually sets us up perfectly for where I think we should go next. And that's talking about the lessons we've learned along the way. Because let's be honest, you don't spend years doing this without making mistakes, breaking stuff, and or realizing you didn't need to buy half that gear you thought you did. So maybe we dig into some of the big takeaways, what we've learned the hard way, and the kind of wisdom we'd like to pass on to anyone starting out, really.
Yeah, I'm smiling and kind of grinning because I couldn't agree more. The gear and the miles are part of it, but it's those takeaways that really shape who we are and on and off the trail. And you're right, none of us get this far without a few hard lessons along the way, a few lost dollars. I know I've had my fair share. So why don't you just go ahead and kick us off with some of your lessons learned?
Okay, yeah, sure. So for me, I'd say one of the biggest lessons learned is around money and gear. Earlier on, I definitely fell into the trap of thinking I needed to buy the expensive stuff just because it looked cool or other people had it. But then sometimes you splurge on items that will last a lifetime. Like I recently got a pair of Alu boxes. The great boxes probably overpriced, but they're an iconic piece of gear in the overland space, and they're that way for a reason. They really last forever. And on the flip side, sometimes the cheaper stuff can also last you a long time. For example, one of my oldest favorite pieces of gear was a King Dewey camp chair that I bought for $20, I believe. It's not fancy, but it works just as well as a $100 backpacking chair. That's when it kind of clicked for me, spend money where it really brings value to your trips, not just because it's the latest or most expensive thing. So now I try to live by a rule. If I don't absolutely need it for my next trip, I don't buy it. It doesn't mean I'm perfect. I still talk myself into the stuff sometimes, but that mindset really keeps me grounded. And at the end of the day, you don't want to roll out to a campsite with gear that you really don't use. That's kind of a
Yeah.
wasted some wasted money and also just a waste of space, really. But the exception, of course, I would say, is safety and recovery gear. That's where you do spend that extra money because if something goes wrong, you want the right tools, because it can literally be life or death, right? But when it comes to the extras like chairs, gadgets, or whatever it is, just keep it simple. Buy what truly adds value and skip all the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, I like that. And it's a sad day that King Due is no longer with us. I feel like that's just even saying King Due is a joy. Sounds like a UFC fighter, you know? So, but yeah, just to build on that. So for me, a big lesson learned, you really came out of the jungle, running a rooftop tent and realizing how much I didn't like having things permanently bolted onto the side or to the side or outside of my rig. I kind of moved away from that. And that experience, the jungle trips, really shaped my design philosophy along with my time in Africa. Now I try to keep things as clean and streamlined as possible. I also learned the hard way that it's easy to get caught up in always needing to do something to your rig before a trip or thinking somehow that it looked tougher than it, if it looked tougher, then it must perform tougher, right? I definitely fell into that trap. One of my biggest regrets was, I hate to say it, adding a 6-inch lift to the Patrol. That was honestly the dumbest decision I've ever made. And, people were trying to steer me away from doing it. And I just like, no, I want to do it. And yeah, it just came back to haunt me. It just messed up the whole geometry and the ride really suffered for it in the shorty. So looking back, I think the sweet spot, in terms of like lift and suspension is probably like 2 inches, 3 max. I think anything beyond that just introduces more problems than it's really worth. And these days, if I were buying a new rig, I'd probably go for something like a Colorado ZR2 Bison, Ranger Tremor, or an Ineos Grenadier Quartermaster if I could ever afford it. Although I did see on Ben Hardy's channel the other day, he had the brand new Ram Prospector on there, and that thing, God, every time I see it, I know that's one of your favorite rigs, but yeah, I just drool over it. But I mean, I think having an OEM vehicle engineered, built, and warranted with the exact specs for overlanding, I think that's like the dream. It's a little pricier up front, but you'll probably spend more piecing it out yourself. And plus you have the peace of mind, when you're going with companies like AEV, straight from the factory that they're actually doing things right. So those are some of my lessons learned, keep it clean, keep it simple. Don't get carried away chasing bigger, badder mods just for the sake of it. I learned a lot about mechanical sympathy too with the Patrol. I used to beat that thing up, and although it might not look that way in some of my videos, I really learned a lot by driving to some really tough places in that truck. So it just goes to show you how tough the Patrols are actually built.
Yeah, they are, man. And on the Tundra, I just picked up, a set of wheels, and I ended up going with basically the actual size is a 20. It's a 285 75 17. So it's right around. We'll call it a 34-inch tire. At first, I was worried it might look a little small, but
Hmm.
honestly, it looks proportional, and I'm kind of glad I won't have to do any ton of trimming on the vehicle because bigger tires always brings more work on the back end. So I'm happy with the balance that I have, and I think that's a good place to really wrap up the episode of Where the Pavement Ends. Today we shared how we first got into overlanding, what it means to us, the philosophies that guide and our builds, and some lessons learned along the way. And if there's a takeaway, it's that overlanding isn't about having the most expensive or extreme setup. It's about building the right rig for you. So let your build evolve over time, and remember, and it's got to be guided by your philosophy and your own priorities, and make sure it actually serves your adventures instead of distracting from them.
Yeah, well said, Terrell. And to everyone watching, thank you for sticking with us this far. We hope it's given you a new or different perspective on how to approach building out an overland vehicle. If you've enjoyed this conversation, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop us a comment below. We'd love to hear how you define overlanding or what lessons learned you've had along the way. And stay tuned for the next episode. We'll be switching gears, literally diving into what happens once we arrive at our destinations. We'll talk a little bit about, some of the activities we do when we get to camp, how we plan, Terrell and I are similar and very different in this regard, which works out really well in terms of our planning and journeying, how we choose camp, and then most importantly, how do we enjoy the places that we journey to. So stay tuned, and until then, we hope you get outside to where the pavement ends.
Exploration.
You there? Tara, you there?
Vince, you there?
Today is not our day.